Say it with me, sing it loud. We will not be
Say hello, I'm John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. I want to thank you for joining me. It is great to be live and doing the show in Washington, D.C. I don't always do the show live in Washington, D.C. As many of you know, I do the show in New York, and it re-airs in D.C. So when we're in Fun Drive, which is what we are in, I usually try to make the time to do a live show so I can reach out to this audience directly. It's not the only case in which I'll do it. So I'm hoping, I've said this in previous shows. I would love to make it down to DC. I would love to come down, do some live events, engage the audience. One of the things that always concerns me about, specifically WBAI sometimes, but even this listening audience, we really need to engage younger people. And I think engaging younger people means we got to engage people more directly. So I'm hoping that there's some live events we can put together, whether they are put together by the station itself, or whether whether we can elicit some call from some of the universities in the area to bring in not just myself but other speakers from WPFW, and that would get me to DC, get me a chance to sit in the studio for the first time. I've never done this show in the studio of WPFW, and I know things have changed a little bit over the years, but I was in the studio years ago as a guest on a show, but I haven't done my show in DC. So it would be something that I would really look forward to. As I said, we are in Fun Drive, so I want to remind people that we are listener-supported radio. We depend almost exclusively on those of you listening to this program. We don't do corporate sponsorship. We don't do underwriting. We certainly don't do commercials, and we don't get any federal funding. All the talk that you hear on other public radio outlets that talk about them losing their CPB funds, we don't get those. We don't get those anyway, and at least we haven't in many, many years. So we rely on you. So you get to dictate whether we exist or not. Bottom line, whether we exist. I mean, that's your call. And of course, you by making donations to the station, especially in the name of a particular show, this one in particular, I hope, you send a message. You send a message about your listenership, and that shows like this intrigue you, and that you appreciate WPFW providing the airspace for voices like mine. And I know, I get it. My voice is a little different than some of the other ones you're going to hear, including if you've ever listened to native podcasts or native news outlets. And I'm going to talk a little bit about one story that I saw on a native news outlet today. I'm going to talk about that. But, I think it's really important that people hear a perspective that challenges the dominant narrative that's out there. And that's what I do. And I'm not playing devil's advocate. I want to be clear. If I voice an opinion, it is a genuine opinion that I have, and it's based on genuine facts. Of course, it is opinionated, and I do hold some bias on the opinions that I express. But it's a funny thing about holding bias. If you've got a history that is plagued with injustice for centuries or longer, I had a conversation and I did a couple of posts about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and this whole idea that some are challenged. Well, should it even be equity? Shouldn't it be equality? Well, I had this debate about whether it should be equity or equality. And the difference between equity and equality, one is about fairness and the other one's about evenness. Well, I don't know how you can actually talk about, you can't just declare equality after centuries of injustice. There has to be a level of fairness that takes into account that you have people who have been cast down to the bottom rungs of society. And I'm not just talking about affirmative action or anything else, but I'm just saying at some point you got to kind of meet people where they're at and where you place them. So if you just put out some call, for employment or for programs, and you're only going to evaluate those candidates based on a set of rules that's already laced with embedded racism, you got to kind of meet people where they're at. So there's a question of fairness as opposed to equality. So I just wanted to say that, and And I think the fact that WPFW gives me an hour each week, that's not just about equality. It's about fairness. It's about equity. It's about giving a space to a voice that isn't being heard anywhere. And my voice, oftentimes, like I said, is a little bit more distinct even than other native voices. So again, I want to remind people we are listener-supported radio. We count on your contributions to WPFW. We hope that you will make donations to the station in the name of this program. But frankly, we just need the fund. We just need the station funded. So even if you're listening to this program and you want to donate towards other programs, it doesn't do much for me meeting my goal. But my ultimate goal is just to keep the station moving forward, meeting the overall goals that we set for our fund drives. And so I will say, though, I greatly appreciate it if I'd like to meet goals. So if you are listening. And whether you're listening on WPFW, I post the show as a podcast. Some of these shows that I record and I post up as YouTube videos, or I put it up on Facebook. So there's any number of ways that you can either listen or even watch the show. But however you're listening, perhaps you're listening online. You've gone to the website and you're listening online. However you're doing it, I hope that you would consider making a donation to WPFW and doing it in the name of Resistance Radio with John Kane. That's my hope. So I'm asking you to go to the pledge line, the pledge line, and it's we got a toll-free number, but I'll give the local number first. It's 202-588-9739. That's 202-588-9739. Or again, we have an 800 number, which is 800-222-9739. That's 1-800-222-9739. Or you can go online. You can go to WPFWFM.org. And, of course, you can see all about the station on that. I mean, that's the station's website. But you can also follow the prompts to make a donation. And, again, from a donating standpoint, you can do something that is a one-time donation. You can do a time donation. You can become a sustaining member of the station by pledging $5, $10, $20 a month. And to be clear here, when we do set goals, if you donate $10 a month, we flag that as $120 donation for the year. So that when I'm trying to raise $500 during my hour on the radio, we're not asking anybody to necessarily drop $500. I wish you would. I really do wish you would, because look, we're broadcasting in Washington D.C. I mean, this is the market of power, right? I mean, this is where the halls of power exist for the entire country. I know there's affluent people there. I don't know how many affluent people listen to this program. This is Resistance Radio. Oftentimes, affluent people steer away from these controversial subjects. But I also know that there's lawyers and there's lobbyists and there are consultants in that D.C. area who've made millions of dollars off of Native people. So when I do a show that's talking about Native issues, I'm talking to you too. And some of the stuff that I talk about, you may use in your work. I may be giving you information that helps you cash in. So I'm asking you to cash out a little bit. I'm asking you to make a donation. Go to WPFWFM.org, make a donation, do it in the name of Resistance Radio. You can do it anonymously. You can leave your name, and we'll give you some props for it. I've got Jacquie Luqman joining me for the program this week, and I hope that you will welcome her to as she sits in with me. I also have a guest joining me at the bottom of the hour, I might add. But Jacquie, give us a little bit more detail on the other means, PayPal, Cash App, and the other ways that people can donate to WPFW.
You bet. And I'm so glad to be on with you today, John. And I love what you opened the show with, because I know I've said it a couple of times before, but life's the way it does, and things get in our way and other priorities. But believe me, we are going to work out some kind of public event where we can do exactly what you are suggesting, because listen, WPFW and the content that's on this network is so critically important to providing the education, the historical education of the history of people's struggle in this country that we know that our young people are not getting in the current infrastructure at any level of education. So, of course, we have to do that. And one way we do that is through these shows on this network. And you can call right now, 202-588-9739 and pledge, as John said, but you can also go to WPFWFM.org on the website and pledge through the website. You can also pledge through Cash App using $WPFWFM. And did you know you can also text your pledge to 801-801, texting the letters WPFWFM. WPFW works every day to build the world we want to inhabit by building a better world, one broadcast at a time. And yes, please make your donation for Resistance Radio, because as different as John thinks his voice is from other voices, different is exactly what we need in this time. So thank you so much for everything you do, John. Appreciate you so much.
Well, you guys did some great programming yesterday. In fact, WBAI carried a little of it on the anniversary of the Palestinian invasion, so to speak, or the invasion of Palestine. And and one of the things that when you talk about celebrating or commemorating, not celebrating, commemorating an anniversary of a country being established on top of an existing population. The thing that I always have to remind people from a Native perspective, yeah, we know what you're going through, and I always have to remind people, the Supreme Court of the United States played a big role in enabling that very thing to happen to us too. And the longest-serving Supreme Court justice of the United States is a guy by the name of John Marshall, and in 1823. Slave era. He served for like 34, 35 years in the at the beginning of the turn of the century in the 1800s. So in 1823, he rules in a case where he essentially codifies the doctrine of Christian discovery into U.S. law, and he not only does that, which in of itself is very problematic. I mean, it essentially says Christians can just claim land of people who are not Christians, the pagan Saracens and other enemies of Christ. That's how the papal bulls actually read it. And they could just lay their eyes upon the land and then claim it, as claim title to that land. But he actually went a next step farther. He said, however extravagant the pretension of converting an inhabited country into conquest may appear, if you establish it in the first instance and then sustain it, if you build a country upon it, then it becomes law and cannot be challenged. He literally said, and he calls it an extravagant pretension. In case you don't know that is basically a euphemism for lying. I mean, so the Supreme Court justice, the chief Supreme Court justice of the Supreme Court basically said, however big the lie is, if we can sustain the lie, then it becomes a truth. That's basically what John Marshall said in 1823. And off of that doctrine of Christian discovery, including this notion that conquest and discovery are interchangeable. I mean, you don't even need to wage war against the people. You just got to lay your Christian eyes upon them, and then you can claim not only the land, but conquest of the people. That's what John Marshall said in 1823. And it is sustained. I will say, he was wrong to suggest that it was affirmed in the first instance, because there had already been treaties signed by the United States acknowledging our land title. In fact, dozens of treaties by then. So when he says, if you can assert it in the first instance and then sustain it, he kind of missed that first qualifier that he threw out there. So, but by saying this, he actually created a pattern where they extended this idea of the doctrine of Christian discovery into the idea that you could actually conquer a people simply by laying your eyes on them. And of course, out of that, they built a couple of other legal doctrines, one called the trust doctrine, one called the plenary powers doctrine. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those things. I know I talked about them in the past, but I got some other things that I wanted to mention here. So about that. But before I get into that, as you know, I played a significant role in getting the statewide ban on mascots in New York State. And the Trump administration decided that they were going to assist or try to assist one of the schools in Long Island, one that kind of votes that voted strongly for Trump in a town called Massapequa, and Trump posed for pictures with the Massapequa logo, I think the Chiefs logo, and he basically supported. And he said he was going to get Linda McMahon, the wrestling lady who he put up as the Secretary of Education. Like those things are so consistent. Yeah, he put her in there, and wanted her to work with whomever they could work with to file a complaint, a civil rights complaint. Now, NYSED, the New York State Education Department, they responded. They submitted their response to the complaint. And one of the things that they submitted was, frankly, something that I almost forgot about. I mean, I've talked a lot about how many years NYSED has taken a position against these mascots, including in 2001 when the commissioner at that time, under the Pataki administration, which was the Republican governor, had issued a memorandum telling schools to get rid of them. Just get rid of the mascots. But he didn't put a deadline on it. He said, do it in a time that's practical. We're not trying to create a financial burden on you. We think what you're doing is wrong, but take your time, phase them out, get rid of them. Well, he did that in 2001. But the reason he did it was that the United States Commission on Civil Rights had issued a position on this. So the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights issued a statement basically condemning the practice and said that they must be removed, that imagery and names associated of native imagery and names need to be removed from sports teams from schools. I mean, so this is and just to remind people, this is 2001. This is the Bush administration. So all those people who think that this is all about weak liberals, snowflakes, wokeism, cancel culture. No, the Republicans in both the state and at the federal level were calling for the removal of this thing in 2001. So I got to put that out there because this whole thing gets turned into a right versus left culture war issue instead of keeping it a right versus wrong issue, which is what it was. But I was really pleased at the response. The folks from NYSED sent me. Emailed me because I sat on their Indigenous Advisory Council. So I'm still in touch with these guys and I get a chance to talk to them or at least correspond. But in this instance, I actually talked to one of the chiefs of staff there. And he also brought something else up that I found interesting. Of course, they did a great job refuting anything that the Trump administration, Linda McMahon, and I think they were even using that crazy organization that calls themselves the Guardians, that they were somehow a plaintiff or something in the complaint. And they got thrown right out because they didn't have any standing, but that was a whole nother issue. But I got a call from one of the NYSED representatives, and he said that he had spoken to some kids at a lacrosse game or tournament where the local kids here, I live on the Cattaraugus territory of Seneca Nation. One of the three schools that service the kids here is Gowanda. So the Gowanda lacrosse girls lacrosse team was playing, and this guy had seen them, and he wanted to ask them about it. Now, honestly, I had no idea if you ask Native kids today about the mascot issue, what the response is. I don't know because, frankly, we don't have a whole lot of access to kids, even in this fight. Most schools would not allow us to come into their school and talk about this. And of course, if you were a school with a Native mascot, you can understand the reasons for that. But the schools that didn't have Native mascots, like Gowanda, our kids here are called the Panthers. And my granddaughter goes to that school, by the way. So he'd asked them how they felt about the mascot issue. And as he was telling me the story, I was a little nervous. I'm thinking, geez, I hope they haven't bought into the media narrative that it's only white people that are calling for this, that Native people don't really care. Because you tell people that you don't care enough, and perhaps that'll sink in. But to a girl that he asked, to every one of the girls, they said, no, we hate it. And he asked, so what is it about it that you so dislike? And they said, they're mocking us. That's literally what these kids in school said. They said they're mocking us. And they're blatant about it. So when we're playing these schools with white girls, and they're all white girls that they're competing against in lacrosse, and they've got a Native mascot, they almost like just put it in your face. So whether they're calling themselves Warriors, Redskins, Indians, or whatever else. So they're playing a Native game, lacrosse, against Native girls, and they're just arrogant and cocky and overtly racist about it. So that's what the girls hated most. It wasn't just the names, but the fact that they were carrying those names playing under those team names, it gave them a level of arrogance and mockery that they always put on display. And I know this has been the case in the past, but I wasn't sure when you ask kids that have not really ever had these public meetings and they haven't talked about it, I wasn't sure what the response would be. And I could not have been prouder of those girls from Gowanda who answered so directly and so strongly about their view of this thing. So that's, again, NYSED continuing to do good work on this issue, even as they have to take on the Trump administration. And I do have to say, all of the media attention that frankly I got when Trump stepped up in this issue, because I played such a singular role in making this ban happen, all of the media attention was really focused around these poor schools having to change their mascot. They never really addressed how we felt about this stuff. And so, I was pleased to have an opportunity to tell our side of the story, but also to push back, because among the things that we were asked repeatedly by any of the, whether it was, print or radio, and I did a whole bunch of interviews in that last week and a half, they all said, well, how much is it a game changer that Trump's involved? And I said, it's not. It's not. I mean, Trump has already threatened schools like New York and Maine, many schools that have like DEI programs. They said, look, if you got diversity, equity, inclusion programs in your school, I'm cutting your funding. Because I'm outlawing that. Because if there's one thing a white man in the White House like Trump wants, it's not equity. It is not inclusion, and it's not diversity. So
Right.
he basically has told schools, I'm going to cut any funding to your schools if you have these programs. So he's already got that threat out there. And to the extent that he's tried to do it directly to Maine, because if you recall, the Maine governor basically pushed back on Trump when he was trying to squeeze the state over transgender, a transgender issue. And basically the governor said, well, I'll see you in court. Well, you know what? She did see him in court, and she kicked his butt in court. I mean, so Trump has not fared well in the courts, even though he's skewed many of the courts, including the Supreme Court, in a big way. He has not done well in court. And so the idea that he might be threatening funding, to withhold lunch money or, special ed, funding to schools because of the mascot issue, which is absurd all by itself. Most of the states aren't going to fold, and New York State certainly hasn't folded. And I got to remind people, this is a strong agency, the New York State Education Department. This isn't the governor doing it. These aren't politicians. These are educators. These are educators who are committed to children who are saying, "Oh hell no, oh hell no, you're not going to come in here and tell us that we've got to erase existing law that's on our books or existing policy that's on our books. No, we're not going to do it." So again, I was proud. I don't usually work well with government agencies. That's not my thing. But I got to tell you.
You sure?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. But what I did was I targeted the NYSED. I targeted the education department because it was less political. It was more apolitical than. I didn't try to get a bill passed through the legislature. No, I wasn't going to go there. I think most politicians are so consumed with getting elected, getting money, broadening their base that, I mean, there's no shame involved. But when I thought about these guys as educators, I said, I think I could appeal to these guys their better human nature, and it did. I mean, that's how we got this thing through. We did it through the education department, not through the state legislature. It'd be great. In fact, shame on the legislature for not following up and passing a law, because they probably should. But you know what? NYSED's upheld. They've been upheld. This ban has been upheld in state court and in federal court. It's not going anywhere. The schools that have been resisting and begging and pleading for Trump to help them, they've run out of options. So I just wanted to put that out there because this is an ongoing battle. And the one thing that I always say about the mascot issue, because people ask me, well, geez, aren't there more important things? Yeah, there probably are. But we're talking about educating children and miseducating children by allowing this stuff to continue. And those children are going to be adults, and they are the adults that my kids and my grandkids have to face. So if we don't nip this in the bud now, and let's be clear, the mascot issue is so emblematic of the unique racism that Native people experience, because nobody else has used as mascots. You know what I'm saying? I mean, they even in their complaint, they tried to use Fighting Irish as an example of how Native people are being singled out, while there's other uses. There's no schools in New York called Fighting Irish. Notre Dame, the university, might use that, but I mean, the absurd complaint, it just shows the ignorance that those involved in it, display every time and this great group that calls themselves the Guardians, they've lost in every legal battle that they've attempted. Even with Trump on their side, even when they've had the Washington football team, endorsing them and funding them, they've accomplished nothing. So this has been a long process for us. But as I say, this is just emblematic of the unique racism. And, and the thing that I wanted to talk about, I got a couple of things, but I dug up some language from the Supreme Court on the trust responsibility. And what the language really demonstrates is how much they know they're lying to us. This is a case called the U.S. versus the Hickory Apache Nation. And what it involved was the Hickory Apache were trying to get disclosure on what the lawyers were negotiating on their behalf when it came to mining. But it wasn't their lawyers, it was government lawyers. But the whole claim is that the United States claims that they are our trustees, that we're wards of the government. So they're saying, okay, if that's the case, then we should be entitled to know what was discussed. And they said, well, no, there's still lawyer-client privilege because those lawyers really represented the United States. They didn't represent you directly. They said, yeah, but if you're claiming to be our trustees, then we should have the information. And they just wanted to know what the details of the negotiations were. And the Supreme Court ruled against the Apache for getting that information. But here's what was interesting. This is what Sam Alito, not exactly a liberal stalwart on the court. This is what Sam Alito had to say. And Jackie, I hope you'll listen to this. I'm gonna read each paragraph and then kind of break it down, because if I read the whole thing, you can get lost. It is, kind of it's white man speak, so it's a little sometimes tough to get through.
Of course I'm listening. Get to it. Come on.
All right. So here's what he opens with. He says, as we have recognized in prior cases, Congress may style its relationship with Indians a trust without assuming all the fiduciary duties of a private trustee, creating a trust relationship that is limited or bare compared to a trust relationship between parties at common law. So in other words, what he's saying is, we know that it's not really a trust. I mean, and if you're saying that it doesn't have to assume all the fiduciary duties of a private trust, the question is, does it have to assume any of them? So this is Sam Alito basically saying, we're just going to style it. We're just going to call it a trust, but it's not going to have the same levels of responsibility and duties that a private trust would have. So is it even a trust? He goes on. He goes, throughout the history of the Indian trust relationship, we have recognized that the organization and management of the trust is a sovereign function subject to the plenary powers of Congress. So let me break that down. So what they're basically saying is, we invented this notion of a trust so we could assert ultimate power over Native people. That's essentially what he's saying. This is subject to the power of Congress. It's not subject to the responsibility or of the so-called beneficiary of a trust, or the wards in this case. No, it isn't. And in fact, he goes further. He says, because the Indian trust relationship represents an exercise of that authority, meaning the authority of Congress, we've explained that the government has a real and direct interest in the guardianship it exercises over Indian tribes. The interest is one which is vested in it as a sovereign. So he basically says, our interest is in asserting authority over it through guardianship. That's what this is all about. This is about asserting guardianship authority over Indian tribes. That's what the whole trust relationship is all about. And it's, of course, and also about the authority of Congress, the plenary powers. And again, these are all, both the trust and the plenary powers doctrine are slave era doctrine that still exists today. I forgot to tell you, this was 2011. So this is just a little over a decade ago. This isn't like 100 years ago. I mean, look, I always talk about Ruth Bader Ginsburg citing the doctrine of discovery. That was 2005. At least that was 20 years ago. This is only 2011. But let me finish. She's got one more paragraph that really kind of sums it up really nicely. I mean,
Oh, it gets better or worse?
it seems like each one you read gets better. It says, this is especially so because the government has often structured the trust relationship to pursue its own policy goals. Thus, while trust administration relates to the welfare of the Indians, the maintenance and limitations which Congress has prescribed as part of its plan of distribution is distinctly in the interest of the United States. So how in the hell do you have a trust that says you're not the primary beneficiary of this trust? We are. And that's
the people who create and manage the trust. They're the ones who are the beneficiaries of the trust.
And this is the Supreme Court Justice Sam Alito admitting it. I mean, this is him saying it in a case where they're showing, yeah, you're not really the primary beneficiary. In fact, we only have to have something that's related to your welfare, not even in your best welfare, but it just has to relate to your welfare. But we're the primary beneficiary. We have the primary interest. This is the Supreme Court again admitting this. And so when I say it, you can say, yeah, well, that John Kane, he's always going to take these extreme views. This is the right wing of the court admitting that they've been lying to us all this time, and that this so-called slave era legal doctrines that are born out of the doctrine of discovery, that cast us as wards of the federal government and cast themselves as our trustees, and then says that Congress has ultimate authority. That's what this is all about. I mean, when I hear these guys saying it and being almost open and honest, if not arrogant about it, I'm just sometimes amazed. And so, I mean, I talk about all these tough things, and I've had people comment, how come you smile so much when you're talking about these terrible things? It's because I get a certain amount of joy out of exposing some of these horrendous truths. I do. I mean, it's kind of what I do. But I mean, can you imagine, Jackie? I mean, can you imagine a Supreme Court justice making this level of admission in the modern era? I mean, it's pretty remarkable.
It's surprising, but then again, it's not surprising, because if you know the history of this country, even a little bit of it, particularly in relation to the legalization, the legal justifications that were created for the degradation and brutalization of our people.
Yeah, what is legal? What is legal is not necessarily what is ethical and what is moral. That's the bottom line. Yeah.
Right. And the redefinition of terms and all of this kind of stuff. It's like it's like finding out a horrible secret in your family that you suspected, but over the years you're like, yeah, I know that's pretty true, but then finding the documentation about it is still like a mind-blowing kind of.
And the problem is that nobody knows this stuff. I mean, that's why I do the show. I mean, Washington D.C. That's why I do the show. These are people who are working where you live. This is the Supreme Court saying that. And you know what? He's not the only one. The crazy part is, I don't know where the liberal justices are. Where's Jackson? Where's Kagan? Where's Sotomayor? Mm-hmm. They didn't say, they didn't weigh in on some of this stuff. And so when Alito and Thomas actually come back around and question, what is the limits of this plenary powers? Because in the Indian child welfare case that where it was challenged by this rich family in Texas who wanted to adopt Native children, and basically cried foul, saying that it was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment because they were being denied the right to adopt Native children, and those poor Native children were being denied the right to be taken in by affluent white people. And so that's what their complaint was. But and you know what the Supreme Court said there? They basically never addressed the Equal Protection Clause. They just basically went back to the plenary powers doctrine and said, well, Congress passed the law, so there's nothing you can do. You can't challenge that. But here's what happened during the oral arguments. They had the Solicitor General of the United States, a guy by the name of Needler, who was basically making the argument about plenary powers. And Alito, and Thomas, they've always been a little bit indifferent about this plenary powers doctrine. And so Alito asked, he said, wait, so if plenary means plenary, so Congress can do whatever it wants? And there's no limitations? Because if there are limitations, and this is in oral arguments with this guy from the Solicitor General's office, and he says, so if there are limits to that power, I don't see where they are. And so Needler is fumbling, in his chair, and he says, well, they are limited by the responsibility associated with their trust responsibility. So talk about circular reasoning. First, they create this trust responsibility out of their means to develop the authority over Native people. And then they say the limits to that authority is the very trust responsibility that we made up. I mean, you can't have more circular reasoning. And so actually, Alito and Thomas, and I'm not sure if anybody else, but two of the right-wing Supreme Court justices basically questioned the plenary powers doctrine as the defense of the Indian Child Welfare Act. The liberal justices threw us under a bus. No, it's too important to keep this law in place. Look, I understand that the intent of the law was supposed to be to protect Native children. But you know what? It didn't give us authority over our own children. It was just a set of federal guardrails that the states had to follow in terms of placing Native children in Native homes. But it never said, no, we're going to give the nations the final say on where a Native child goes. It didn't do anything like that. So it was just more of the same, more of being managed by federal law. And in this case, and I'm not saying that Alito or Thomas, I don't know what their driving force behind them was, but they basically said, we still don't see where Congress has that power. And we certainly don't see where the limits to that power or where the checks and balances. Because if the only thing you have to argue about a law passed by Congress about Native people is whether Congress passed it or not. I mean, there is no defense. I mean, there's no challenges, is what I'm saying. This family, with oil money behind them, tried to challenge the constitutionality of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And they said, no, you can't challenge the constitutionality of that law because if Congress passed it, it's legal. Because we have already long held that Congress has ultimate power over the affairs of Native people. And so the reason I do this show is because people have no idea. So when I talk about mascots, it's easy for me to say, yeah, that's kind of racist. I mean, it's not a stretch. But when I say no, there are underlying laws today that still cast Native people in a unique and subjugated position. I mean, think about this, Jackie. For most of the years that we've interacted, even with Congress, we weren't U.S. citizens. So they were passing laws about us while we weren't U.S. citizens, but they already started calling us wards of the federal government. They were calling us children that would never mature. We would never graduate from that ward status. So when, if you are familiar at all with the film Killers of the Flower Moon or the book, these were wealthy Osage people because they were wealthy because the oil was discovered there. But the federal government said, nah, we can't let these ignorant people have their own money. So the federal government said they all need to have guardians. They need to have people who will manage their money for them. And they have to report to those guardians, those custodians, each month. And they have to submit any of their proposed spending to these white men who were basically going to have control over the money. And what was born out of that lopsided relationship were murders where the Osage were murdered for their money. But the whole idea that you could convince the people you're too incompetent to have your own money, so we're going to manage it for you. Well, that still exists today. I mean, when they passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act in 1988, they basically said Native people are too incompetent to run their own gaming. So we're going to make them enter into gaming compacts with the states that surround them. And that's why we have a situation here in New York where the Senecas basically had over $500 million extorted from them by the Democrat governor, Kathy Hochul, who was squeezing them for $560 million of revenue sharing that she claims that they owed them. And when I say extorted, here's the thing. Here was the leverage she used. She didn't just use law. She didn't use the Interior Department, whose job it is to manage some of this stuff. She froze their bank accounts, their operating accounts. These guys had checks written. There were checks bouncing. She does this on a Friday. By Monday, the Senate is conceded, and they wrote the check.
Wow.
500. And then she took that check. You may not be familiar with this in Washington, D.C., but then she took that check and took $400 million of it and gave it to the local billionaire who wanted to build a new stadium for the Buffalo Bills team that he owns.
Oh my God. That is, you see, listeners.
You can't make this up, right?
You can't make this psychotic stuff up. Only insane people do this kind of thing. And I almost don't want to give them that, because I just feel like that really makes it even harder for people who have legitimate, mental health issues that need help. These people don't need help. They need to be stopped.
They need to be stopped. This isn't insanity. This is just immorality. This is just immorality. And like I said, the Republicans don't have a monopoly on racism. This was Kathy Hochul, a Democrat, governor, the first woman governor of the state of New York, who locked up the Seneca Nation's entire system by freezing the bank accounts. Not just one, all of their operating accounts she locked up and said, I'm locking these things up until you pay me. And so they paid her. So they paid her.
So John, you mean to tell me that the world is not going to be a better place if it's run by women? That's another thing people tell us. That
not
the
necessarily.
Democrats,
there are corrupt women on both sides of the aisle, and there are corrupt men. So no, you can't assume that gender fixes this. Or gender indifference fixes it.
Right. Just like you can't assume that a politician with a D behind their name is going to fix this either. But real quick, John, I've got an update for us, and it's great. First, I want to say thank you to our listeners who contributed to the Latin Music Collective. Thank you so much. We appreciate you. But thank you, Anonymous, for your contribution to this show during this hour. John, we've got $260 to go. $260. You all can do this. We know you can do it, dear listeners, because you've done it so many times before. And honestly, most of the people who are listening right now, I know you are fascinated by this history that you're hearing from John Kane that you haven't learned from anywhere else. You've never heard this. Most of you aren't members of WPFW yet. And that's true of most of the shows on this network. 92% of the listeners are not members. If each of you listening right now to our voices give just $10 a month, that would be fantastic. We would be practically unstoppable. Support independent media, support Resistance Radio, empower your station, and doing what you can to empower yourself, your neighborhood, your city, and your world. Become a member today, right now. Pick up the phone, call 202-588-9739. Go to WPFWFM.org on the web. Submit through Cash App, $WPFWFM, or text to 801-801, the letters WPFWFM, all of those ways that you can send us a contribution that the hosts of these shows don't get, by the way. We don't get paid. John Kane doesn't get paid. I don't get paid to share this history that coincidentally, John, believe it or not, this is right along the line of what I'm going to talk about on Darker Than Blue at 5 o'clock today.
There you go.
And this is amazing. This is how interconnected our struggles are. So please pick up the phone, go to the web, go to Cash App, text your donation, your monthly sustaining donation of just $10 a month to Resistance Radio and Darker Than Blue right now. We cannot do this without your support.
That's absolutely true. And again, we call it independent radio, but there's nothing that makes it more independent than the fact that we depend on you. I mean, you actually can dictate our success, or our failure. So again, I ask you to go, $10 a month. If a couple of you step up and do $10 a month, I meet my goal. Bottom line, I meet my goal. So please do. Please become a sustaining member of the station. Or if, like you said, if you one-time donation. And like I said, I'm sorry. There are those of you listening to the show, and certainly in this market, that are affluent, whose some of that affluence has come from some of the issues that I talk about here. And look, I know what native news media does. I know what the mainstream media does, but even native news media gets a lot of this stuff just wrong. And I got to tell you about, I don't know if you saw this one, Jackie, but RFK Jr., just saying his initials at this point, because we know who he is, it just brings a smile to your face, right? Well, RFK Jr., he testified before Congress, and he was basically saying that ultra-processed food represents genocide to Native people. Now, I saw a lot of Native people goes, oh, yeah, I agree with them on that one. Well, here's the problem. For one thing, genocide is a war crime. It's a war crime committed by people in power against, and the idea of genocide, for an act of genocide to meet the definition, there has to be intent to destroy the people. Now, look, I get it. Pop-Tarts are bad for you. Hot Pockets, Kraft dinner. I get it. It's bad for you. But you know what? So was rancid, large, and wormy flour that you were distributing to Native people that isn't so ultra-processed. That's what fried bread is not one of our traditional foods. It became a traditional food because it became part of things that sustained us. When lands were lost, when our means to sustain ourselves was taken away, you sent us rancid lard and flour. So fried bread became something that we ate. And you also sent commodity cheese. None of that stuff was good for us. And our diabetes and obesity started then. It didn't start with Pop-Tarts. I mean, it didn't start with ramen noodles. Now, granted, none of that stuff is good for you. But it isn't targeted towards us. It's targeted toward poor people generally. Cheap food is what has made these food companies rich. And they've created this cheap, unhealthy food, and they don't intentionally make it unhealthy. It's just that it's unhealthy because it's cheap. That's why it's unhealthy. And of course, we all become targets of that. The Dollar Generals and Family Dollars that are on every corner of small town USA selling this crap, it isn't genocide. Genocide is a war crime. And by calling this genocide, this moron is undermining what genocide truly is, because we have experienced genocide, and we do experience genocide. The fact that the courts are still upholding this notion that we're wards of the federal government, that is genocide. The fact that you have impoverished us. Look, I listened to some of what RFK had to say, and he said, yes, our autonomy would be the real solution. But you know what? It isn't just autonomy. You owe us. You've taken lands. You've taken resources. You've taken our children. You've murdered our children. So don't just tell me now, as you sit there as a wealthy white man, although, can somebody please tell me why this Irish guy is so dark? I mean, is this another bronzing thing? Like, I don't, oh, sorry. I get distracted. I get distracted looking at the guy's face. I'm sorry.
I suspected it might have something to do with some of his naturopathic or homeopathic
didn't he say something about bathing in sewage? I mean, did this guy actually say that?
He and his grandkids took a dip in Rock Creek, in the stream in Rock Creek Park, and I live in DC, and I wouldn't do that.
I don't know. Anyway, I don't want to get you distracted by the way the guy looks. I don't actually like making fun of the way somebody looks, but this guy's strange on so many levels. But it is a travesty to call the cheap food genocide. It's terrible for you. I get that. And the food deserts that exist throughout the United States, not just on native territories, but throughout the United States. And yes, we have been deprived of the resources and even the lands that have been taken from us, to be able to sustain ourselves. And so, yeah, I think there's some policy shifts that need to happen, but most of it is there's a debt that's owed. There's a debt that's owed. And that's what has to be taken care of. Don't call Pop-Tarts genocide. I'm sorry. I just have a major issue with this guy throwing that word around because it undermines what true genocide is, like what's happening in Gaza, like what's happening in Africa, like what's happening today, to this day, in Native territories. I mean, there's no greater example of genocide than what residential schools were. What residential schools represented was the most clear, and it was almost like they developed residential schools around the definition of genocide. 5 things represent genocide: the intentional causing of death to destroy a people, the intentional injury to a people with the intent to destroy them, creating conditions that intend to destroy them, like taking away all elements of their culture, sterilization, and of course taking children. That's exactly what residential schools were all about. So I'm sorry, RFK, if you're going to sit there and tell me that ramen noodles represents genocide and ignore that, it just makes me angry. And yeah, I know I talk about all this absurd stuff with a smile on my face, but don't let my smile be mistaken for the fact that yeah, this angers me. And I would love to be in a room with this guy, because I just think that nobody adequately challenges this notion. And when I see Native News Online, Levi Rickard, giving this guy a platform to spin this kind of crap, or any of the other news outlets, I'm sorry. Nobody should accept this moron standing before Congress calling processed food genocide, when the real genocide still continues to this day. And it's all about, it is all about restoring what was lost and what was taken. Not just our autonomy, land, resources, our distinction. So I had to bring that up because I saw that story, and the first thing that I saw were people that I respect saying, this guy's a moron, but I agree with what he's saying. No, you don't. You don't agree with what he's saying, because if you think that the food industry is targeting us exclusively, for one thing, you're wrong. I mean, I know commodity foods targeted us exclusively for a while, but that's fry bread. I mean, every time somebody puts a picture up of commodity cheese and it goes through Indian country, oh yeah, my grandmother loved that stuff. She made the best macaroni and cheese with that. She made the best grilled cheese sandwiches with that. I'm sorry, that stuff was crap. It was garbage. So was the flour. So was the lard, because none of that stuff was our diet. We didn't eat cheese. We didn't eat fry bread. Even this notion of bannock, which is essentially fried bread with other stuff mixed in, we ate corn, we ate vegetables. That's what we ate. We ate low fat meats. That's what we ate. So when I see this stuff, canned meat, ultra processed cheese, and fat and lard, come on. I mean, I'm sorry, listening to RFK try to create push his agenda by calling the food supply to us genocide. That's just wrong on so many different levels. So, look, I do want to remind people, we're closing up the show here. We are listener-supported radio. We do count on your contributions. Look, and I know it's tough. I mean, anytime you're in Fund Drive, I know the listeners probably get somewhat put off when we're asking them to send money, but that's how we exist. We exist on your donations. We exist on your pledges and your commitment to the station. So we ask that you become a member. And I know it's a single digit, percentage of people who actually listen to the show who donate. And we're asking just a few more percentage points to step up. We're asking for a few more of you. It would be great if all of you who listened donated. It would be great. But I'm just asking to carve out another percentage or two. Let one of the listeners do a $10 or $20 donation. A $20 donation, and I'm there. I meet my goal, essentially. So, I got to tell you, I know some of you call in. One of the things that I noticed when we do the tallies, I don't get a whole lot of people from the Cash App crowd, or the PayPal crowd, or the text crowd. Why don't one of you guys make a donation using that? Just show me that it works. Show me that if you make a donation through Cash App or texting or PayPal or whatever else in the name of the station, let me at least register something on that. I get the donations on the calls. I do, and I appreciate that. But I'd like to see us move into the new generation here, the modern technology. Let one of you guys at least do a Cash App donation. I'd love to see one show up on the tally sheets later on. Jacquie,
Yeah,
as always, it's a pleasure to have you join us and join this program. I look forward to doing some programming together with you. And you and I have a history. We go back even before doing any of this. So it was great to catch back up with you. As soon as somebody dropped your name, I says, Jacquie Luqman, I know that name. Yeah, I've done some shows with her. Let's do some more. Let's do some together. Oh, I might have dropped off. All right. Well, I want to thank you guys for listening. This is John Kane. This is Resistance Radio, and I thank you for listening. We'll be back next week. Stay tuned. Yahweh.